So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are back into the lectionary. The lectionary is the kind of collected readings, the cycle of readings that many churches around the world use. I like using it, as I've mentioned before, because sometimes it forces you to spend some time with passages of Scripture that by personality or by denominational background, etc., you might be more likely to skip over. And so I mention that because we're going to look at a passage out of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which probably falls into that for me. It's one that is about eschatology. It's about the end times of the world, or the fact that the world is ending. And it's one that I think has a very striking image in it, one that I think we do need to spend time with. But I'll admit, it's one that I would probably pass over if I was not forced to look at and spend a little more time with. So, as I said, it is an end time passages. It's an eschatological passage talking about the end of the world. And I think the way in popular culture we talk about kind of the end times or the end of the world is a little misleading for how the Bible tends to talk about it. So I've used a couple of times the word end, right? We think of things ending. And it's like almost like a cliff. The road has run out. It's the end of the road, and it's like, we all fall off. And I think in popular imagination, that is what the end times are. Yeah, it's going to be this really kind of horrible, devastating time. In the end, everything is destroyed. And hopefully, if as a Christian you believe there is a happy ending, and good things will come from this again. But this image of ending or breaking things apart is not really, I think, the best description of the way the Bible talks about a lot of the time. They use this Greek word telos, which has to do with like a goal that has been worked towards and completed. Maybe the consummation of history rather than the end of history might be a better way of thinking it. The fact that God's work has been leading up to something, kind of a peak, a goal being achieved, a consummation, a completion, a restoration to wholeness again. I think these are more helpful words for the way the Bible tends to talk about it rather than end and this idea of like, breaking something or destruction or this disintegration of things, which again, I think is in many of our minds when we talk about some of these things. So before I jumped in, I am going to ask on Sunday, give me some of your basic associations with it. Why do end times things fascinate us so much? Why do people like thinking about it? Why do people like talking about it so much? And why might that kind of, you know, um, taint the way we're thinking as we're thinking about end times passages? So again, eschatology is the technical term for the study of the end times, the completion of human history. And I've heard it said that the book of 1 Corinthians, one of the major goals that this letter to Paul is responding to, is a probably overly realized and obsessive eschatology like we still see in churches nowadays that are kind of obsessed with the end times. And as is often the case, when you think that the world is ending soon or you think something bad is going to happen, whether we're in a crisis situation, etc., there tend to be kind of two choices and two results. One is, okay, everything's about to end, nothing really matters. Great, let's just do whatever we want, right? Hedonism, woo, nothing matters, no consequences, no time. And we see that this assumption seemed to be operating in this Corinthian church that Paul is writing to. There seems to be some just kind of sense, the world's ending, what does it matter? God's going to burn it all down anyway. I think the other potential direction you can take that is one of almost kind of asceticism, of trying really hard because, oh man, time is short, we got to work really hard. And it seems in the Corinthian church particularly, and maybe this is because it was kind of an up and coming town. It's got a reputation a lot like, LA. It's a place where people go to make something of themselves. But they seem to have taken their asceticism, this idea of we've only got a little of time, we better try really hard, in an almost competitive direction. We're all trying to change, we're all trying to try hard, we're all trying to kind of one up one another so I can be the most spiritual, so God can be the most impressed with me. And so we see a lot of this kind of one-upmanship, this tearing down of the people around, and lack of unity, and looking for ways to take advantage of one another and show how spiritual we deeply are, is hiding behind a lot of the conversations Paul is having with his church as well. So we get two very different responses, both of which are pretty dysfunctional, especially when you throw them together in a church, right? And so this section of the book is largely gotten away from kind of that thinking and the kind of theology side, and they're kind of into practical matters. They're asking stuff like, okay, if the world is going to end, if God is good and real, what does that mean for my business life? What does that mean for my marriage? What does that mean for the fact that we're happy or sad, etc. And so we're kind of into the practical weeds in some way, but again, this small passage, I'm sorry, that was a lot of context because it's part of a much bigger conversation in this book. But this little passage, I think, gives us an interesting way to get our hands on maybe a healthier eschatology than the end times stuff in the midst of this much bigger conversation. Okay, I need to read the Bible. I've been talking way too much. Okay, so in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we get a couple of verses. It says, "So this is what I'm saying." And at the end, this is an end of a lengthy kind of discussion about marriage and its kind of requirements, its expectations of us as people. It does cost a lot. It says, okay, so this is what I'm saying. Brothers and sisters, the time has drawn short. From now on, those who have wives should be like people who don't have them. Those who are sad should be like people who aren't crying. Those who are happy should be like people who aren't happy. Those who buy something should be like people who don't have possessions. And those who use the world should be like people who aren't preoccupied with it. Because this world, in its present form, is passing away. And so I think that final image, the world in its present form is passing away, is the one that people were drawn to in this passage. It's the one that we need to spend a little time kind of sitting with. So at first pass, I think you could make the mistake of thinking that Paul is in fact arguing kind of for the ascetic crowd, right? Like we got to try harder, we got to one-up each other, we got to show how spiritual we are because time is running out, right? Like you should act like you don't have a wife, you shouldn't engage in business. But that's actually not what he says here. His stance is largely you need to stay in the position you're in. And we hear him say this to married people and to single people. We hear him say even to slaves and masters that, yes, use your opportunities. At the same time, don't obsess over the opportunities. And I think that is what carries through. If this is an asceticism, he doesn't say, those of you who are married, leave your wives to show how deeply spiritual you are, or leave your husbands to update the language. They couldn't actually leave their husbands back in the day, but that's because they were chauvinistic jerks as a society. Anyway, those of you who are engaged in business, don't do that anymore. He does not say leave all these things, which is, I think, what the ascetic crowd was looking for, right? Like, okay, try harder, leave behind all those things. And this is what most of the end times cults tend to do. This is what, like the Millerites and, the Hale-Bopp Comet people, they all left every aspect of their lives because they were sure of when the world was ending. So I left all this stuff behind and I don't need to do it anymore. And if that's what the argument is, he's making it in a pretty lame way. Not, leave your spouses, leave your businesses, do all these things. The world is ending. He says, well, those of you who do those things, in some ways you need to act like those who don't do those things. And so I don't think we can go with they don't matter, just enjoy them to the fullest. The world's going to burn anyway, right? You can't really go with either of those options. And so what I think the problem with so much like end times thinking, eschatology thinking, is we're so concerned with kind of the chronology of it, right? When is this going to happen? Because if it's happening soon, we need to either not care anymore, stop doing all our normal things, or of course try really hard. As I've been saying, these are the two kind of options we tend to go with. And I think Paul, who probably did believe that the world was going to end within his lifetime, but I don't think that's the point he's trying to make here. He doesn't seem that concerned with when the world is ending. It's not a chronological, it's not a kind of quantitative eschatological thinking that he's interested in. He's interested in a quality of life. He's interested in kind of a theological basis for eschatology. He is not saying when matters, because then you need to do this, needs to do this. He's saying, okay, whatever our distractions are in life, whatever our responsibilities are in life, whether they're civic, family, commercial, our engagements, I don't think he is saying are a bad thing, right? He's not saying leave behind all things in the world, as again is so often the case when people get obsessed with end times. He's saying that they are also not everything. All of these things, whether it's our marriages, it's our places of work, it's our deepest joys, it's our heartbreaking sorrows. All of these things can, if we are not careful, become the sole focus of our attention. And so, if the world is ending, he's not saying leave it all behind. He's also not saying don't let this become your entire world. The only thing you look at, you're always looking for the next thing. You're always trying to do it right in those situations. He says, look, human history has a culmination. Human history has a completion. This is actually all headed somewhere. So, how are we as spouses in light of the fact that the world is not always going to look like that, that God is completing things and God is wanting to do those things right now? I think the ideal way to read this passage is recognize what the world is, what our responsibilities are in it, and yet we shouldn't be like those who are so preoccupied with it, because this world, whether it's the big world, our culture, globalization, those huge political issues that we care so much about and should care so much about, or it's highly individual and local, our personal interests, our personal sorrows and pains, the relationships of those around us. All of these things in their present form are passing away. And I think the Bible makes a very strong argument, not that all these things are just going to burn down so they don't matter. I think they matter a great deal to God, just as they matter a great deal to us. But they are passing away in their current form. We can either undervalue them, and yet these are things that are valuable to God. And I think we see many passages in the Bible, there's a continuity between this world and that. We can't say these things completely don't matter, but they also cannot hold our full attention. These things, these responsibilities, these loves, these sorrows and hates, they are going somewhere. Is it going to become the world in and of itself, or are we willing to listen to God and not become preoccupied with them, because this world in its present form is passing away? And I think, as always comes up with end time stuff, as always comes up with, the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, this can be something that we either find really frightening, or it can be something that we find very freeing, depending on our comforts, depending on our level of attachment to the way things are. And so I think this passage is a reminder, hey, look, all of these things are important, but they're important in light of where this thing is headed, of what God would have us do in them. I think it's similar to kind of this old philosophical idea of the memento mori. Remember you're going to die, right? That can make us depressed and not cared. We can recognize that the world in its present forms are going to end, or we can use it to quicken ourselves and recognize God is doing something eternal. He's bringing those responsibilities, those things we do day in and day out, things that feel spiritual, things that feel totally mundane. Our marriages, our places of work and business, our sorrows, our joys, the things in our world that preoccupy us, right? All these things are meant to be drawn into the culmination, the completeness, the renewing at the end of time. Is that how we treat our lives? Or are we just kind of killing time because none of this matters? Or are we totally obsessed with the things in our life because everything matters? I think there's a freedom God is offering us to kind of sit between these two poles that the Corinthian church fell into so much. There is a freedom in holding all these things lightly. They are important, but they are not ultimate. So let us enjoy them and express our love of God in them. Let them be part of what is completed at the end of the world, or maybe even better, at the completion of the world that is coming. So I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts. I know it's a fairly different take than sometimes we say or feel about end times, but it's one I think I can argue pretty well from the Bible that Paul is bringing this up not to add a sense of urgency, but a sense of fullness and recognition of how important these things are in our lives. So again, all our responsibilities, all of our loves, all of our hates, I think God desires that we engage in them in light of the fact all human history is heading towards his plan, his culmination, and that when we do all those things in light of how God would have them done, they're going to look very different. We're going to be free of the fear and the anxiety of them, but we're going to be able to enjoy them in I think, a humbler way that will be in better line with what God's desires are for them.